Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation. I'm honoured to speak here. Thank you to Ben for a great opening talk. In this sort of 15 or so minutes, I'm going to reflect on the theme of the panel from the perspective of someone who's actually been examining state-private sector surveillance for around 10 years now. And we kind of all know that Snowden was a watershed moment in many ways because of its revelation of the concerted international abuses of human rights. From a press point of view, the press were integral in revealing but also debating both sides of the argument. And of course, citizens then became more aware of the surveillance that was being undertaken on them, but also this kind of backed up to an already existing awareness of the surveillance society. Following Anderson, however, in the UK, it doesn't seem to have deterred the government from pursuing this idea of bulk communication surveillance. But reflecting through the lens of my own research, I'm going to argue that blanket state surveillance actually sits very awkwardly over the complex, heavily infrastructuralised and multi-layered business networks which make up an industrial sector, and I think Ben has already alluded to that in his opening speech. So for the next 20 or so minutes, I'm going to talk about what my concerns are in this area based on the research I've done. So first of all, what's the state been up to? Well, I think we all know that using the private sector to surveil the general population has its roots in post 9/11 legislative innovations in the UK at least. We have numerous acts of parliament now which mandate the private sector to do various things to collect and transfer data to government about the population. So, for example, we have the Anti-Terrorism Crime and Security Act 2001, Proceeds of Crime Act 2002, Immigration, Asylum and Nationality Act 2006, Counter-Terrorism Act 2008, and of course, our favourite, the Data Retention and Investigatory Powers Act 2014. So this 15 or so year history of legislation really is designed to force, and I use the word force very deliberately there, the private sector to pass information about financial transactions. This actually goes back to the late 80s as well. Travel movements and now communications. But as someone who's looked at this in detail and spoken to the companies involved, what's astonishing to me is that the UK government does not appear to have learned from past failed attempts to try to do this, to try to do bulk surveillance of the population. And when I was reading the Select Committee inquiry notes from the Communications Data Bill, it was quite clear that the concerns expressed by internet service providers about bulk communication surveillance really do echo those expressed by, for example, airlines in relation to the e-Borders programme, which has now been written off as a failure. Now, some of the concerns of the ISPs were, for example, the massive cost associated with building onshore data facilities within the UK to keep the data that they had to collect for 1 year. And that was a huge barrier to compliance for them. One of the things they also pointed out was that there was very little clarity in relation to how the mass surveillance mandate would actually intersect with their existing legal obligations, particularly under data protection law. The requirement to give encryption to keys to government, as we've already heard, was damaging to consumer trust and would wreck previously highly trusted supply chain relationships. And there was also very little evidence that there was going to be some guidance from the government over what they wanted. Essentially, it was a matter of sovereign brute power on the part of the government towards the corporations. So we have concerns about competitive advantage, customer relationship, supply chain relationships, technical capabilities, data storage, regulatory quality and cost. Quite clearly, I work in a business school, okay, so just bear in mind that that's where I'm coming from. Now, if we turn back the clock a few years, exactly the same concerns were expressed by the e-Borders in relation to the e-Borders programme by the travel sector. And these were again publicly expressed in select committee hearings and were roundly ignored by the Trusted Borders Consortium, who sought to put the programme into place. And now this has been quietly abandoned as a failure. It's been swept under the carpet completely. Aviation security, I think, is going to be coming back in the near future. However, e-Borders programme, I'm going to talk about that for a second. That programme mandated all airlines to collect and transfer to government all passport data relating to every journey made into and out of the UK between 24 hours and 30 minutes of departure. The information was held in an active database for 5 years and then was archived for a further 5 years. But like mass communication surveillance, the problems with e-borders stem not only from the legal aspects, which are very clear, but also the practical aspects of its delivery. And all of these concerns were highlighted by industry up front, much in the same way as the ISPs are doing now. And what happened with e-borders happened because these concerns were ignored. So, for example, all airlines are not alike. All airlines have to pass data, but all airlines are not alike. It's comparatively easy for a national legacy carrier such as British Airways or KLM or something like that to pass data to government because their seats are for sale using things called global distribution systems. So every travel agent in the world has access to a global distribution system which sells the seats of these airlines. They enter the passport data of the customer, it's all automated. If you're a carrier that perhaps as academics we're all used to going on, budget airlines, as well as charter airlines such as TUI or Monarch or anything like that, they're not listed on global distribution systems, so the infrastructure is working against them. They had to spend roughly £450 million to comply with this legislation, implementing things like customer websites, self-service kiosks in airports. You see those now, that's because of e-borders. And all the helplines and call centres which were there at the retail operator's expense to transfer the information. What happened was that no one really knew what they were doing. There was a huge panic over loss of custom because essentially customers were going to the airline's website to put their information in rather than come to the person who'd sold them their travel. So you have a fragmented industry structure. You have problems also in the airports. If you're a low-cost carrier, you don't own your ground handling system in the airport, you rent it from the airport itself or from the ground handling provider. It actually transpired that there was actually no physical way to get the data out of those ground handling systems in time to send it to the UK Border Agency in the time limits subscribed. The massive investment in the Trusted Borders Consortium resulted in a failure to deliver front-end systems in airports. Essentially, the whole thing was £60 million over budget and it cost £750 million in the first place. The final nail in the coffin was the legal side. Again, this was highlighted by the airlines in advance, much in the way that the comms providers are now saying, well, how does this interact with my existing legal obligations? Early in 2010, the European Commission informed the British government that what they were doing compromised freedom of movement in Europe. The scheme also breached Belgian, French and German data protection law. Our Information Commissioner, is there anyone from the Information Commissioner's office here before I say what I'm going to say? No? Okay, good. Bless him. Suggested that citizens can opt out. We can opt out of this this data transfer process. But, of course, airlines then across the sector faced the huge cost of changing all their systems which have been designed around mandatory data collection. There was no opt-out built in. So what we had in the end with e-borders was legal stalemate. You have patchy collection of data from countries where e-borders was actually legal and plenty of countries where it wasn't. It was a complete failure. So my question really is, why do we still see these attempts to gather data en masse from the private sector? I don't even need to mention the ID card scheme as another mass surveillance failure. Perhaps the contact point as well is another mass surveillance failure. And my question is really, why doesn't the government take notice of what industry tells them? And I think perhaps Ben has already answered that question in his opening talk. Another interesting area for me is the issue of media coverage. The e-borders disaster did not really get any media coverage at all. If you're researching it like I am, you really have to dig around for evidence about it. We don't even see much coverage in the business press of business perspectives. We don't see much coverage about resource use. Who meets the cost of the extra investment? Is it the consumers? What's passed on to them? Do the shareholders suffer? Where's the debate? And in a very interesting conversation I had with a leading BBC journalist last year, he said, well, post-Snowden, surveillance isn't really news anymore. We don't really talk about it. It's not that exciting. There's not many juicy headlines out of it. We tend not to cover it. And this is the BBC talking to me there. So what are the issues, really? Well, when we've just finished a bunch of research funded by the FP7 where we looked about informed citizenship and citizenship engagement around surveillance issues. And what we found was that when citizens are better informed about these things, they are more ready and willing to appraise the risks and the benefits of surveillance and security systems like this. So what kind of risks are we talking about? Maybe there'll be some headlines here. There are transparency risks, first of all. So when we rely on commercial organisations to supply data, we introduce new levels of opacity in terms of processes and responsibilities for surveillance. So how can consumers know what's done with their data? Where's the transparency there? How can other supply chain members know that their business relationships aren't being compromised, their business models aren't being compromised? There was a beautiful moment in e-borders where the UK Border Agency was saying to the airlines, well, if you don't meet our processes, change the way you do business. Completely unacceptable. Another issue that we found was the issue of feedback from government. Are you doing a decent job with this? Are you doing the right thing, collecting the data and storing it in a particular way? So the second area is accountability risks. There's a lot of public and private resources spent on this, a lot. What does value for money mean here? Is the investment worth it? Who pays? The taxpayer, the consumer? How do we find out about the effectiveness and efficiency of what's been undertaken? Are consumers paying more because of the heavy investment in facilities? And how secure are the data that are being stored? And my final point is about trust. Mass surveillance involving the private sector raises trust issues between companies and their customers and their business partners. Okay, that's very clear. But what's more pressing, I think, is the government's record of incompetence in the context of mass surveillance. It's not really going to instil the greatest degree of public trust. The very fact that Snowden happened in the first place points to a failure in security. A failure in security on the part of the NSA. What are they supposed to be looking after? Security. So shortly after that, it was revealed that the GCHQ were acting in contravention of their human rights, despite the UK government strenuously denying that. And even the Investigatory Powers Tribunal started to criticise them. So how can we really know, how can the public know what security agencies are doing, whether they're acting within their powers, whether they're acting in the interests of us all as a community, and whether they're competent to do the job? The three elements of trust: competence, integrity, benevolence. And right now the answer to that is not very clear. So to sum up, from my point of view, it's possible and desirable and respectful of human rights to conduct targeted surveillance, perhaps, on identified subjects at particular times and places with independent judicial oversight. It is less desirable and, moreover, not particularly feasible to collect information on everything and everyone en masse from complex corporate networks with diverse technical operating standards, supply chains, business interests and strategy. And it's certainly not in compliance, I don't think, with internationally recognised human rights legislation. So really, I just want to finish by saying that I am going to continue to question the sense behind this strategy when we see some kind of meaningful interaction between what Ben called the centres of power to produce something that's actually in everybody's interests. So that's me. Thank you.